Thank you, Simon. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. So I'll start with a question, and I'll give a little bit more explanation about what we're going to be talking about today. So when we're talking about doctors, we're talking about decision making. How many decisions do you think a doctor makes in a given day at work? Ballpark. 100? 1,000? So in a study done on pediatric cardiologists, they make about 158 clinically significant decisions every day. So you can imagine it's a lot more than that. But those are the ones that are clinically significant. Can you imagine calculating 158 important decisions in your workday every day? Overwhelming. When we think about doctors and how they make those decisions, if you ask them, how do you do that? And if we assume based on our kind of assumptions about doctors, we would say those decisions are made based on data, right? One would hope. How many of those 158 decisions every day do we think are actually made based on data? Percentage. 10, 30? Nobody's saying 100? So 80% have zero basis in data. So 20% are data-based. So the vast majority are based on other things, like your emotions, like this patient just wants something and I need them out of my office so I can talk to the next person, like I don't want a lawsuit, intuition, habit. That's 80% of what drives doctors' decision making. But we talk about data 95% of the time. So we're missing something here. Excuse me, and just to add to that, of those 20% where there's some data adjacent to that decision making, only 3% of those decisions are actually, can they point to, this study is exactly related to this decision that I'm making right now, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. So we talk a lot about data, but we're missing most of what drives doctor decision making, and that's the human side, that's the biases, that's the emotion, that's the social and contextual influences, and so that's where behavioral science comes in. This is important to remember. I know you're often reminded of this at conferences. HCPs are people too. We remind ourselves, and then we go back to talking about the data for the HCPs. So I'm here to kind of reinforce that, and we're going to talk about how to deal with that in an effective way, because I think a lot of people gloss over it because you say, okay, emotions, that's fuzzy, that's a little bit intangible. I don't know what to do to influence that, so I'm going to stick with the data because that's concrete. I can get my hands around it. But in fact, HCPs are just like us. We are all a lot more irrational than we think we are. Our logic can be quite chaotic. We're really influenced by our emotions to the point where we actually neurologically cannot make decisions without emotion. And people with the emotional part of our brain damaged from illness or accident, they cannot get dressed in the morning because motion is motivating and it's differentiating. So it's fundamental to decision making. We're very social. So we really care about what other people are doing. We care about what other people think of us. Our habit and our context drive us much more than we realize. And we act a lot on our intuition. So this is us, and us includes HCPs. So this is what we need to be looking at for that 80% of what drives our HCP decision making. And so now we're going to come back to the behavioral science. Now that we've set up the challenge, this is going to be the solution toolkit we're talking through the rest of our time together. So how familiar are we with behavioral science? Has anybody here read in Nudge, Predictably Irrational? A few, great, awesome. Or you've seen one of our talks at previous Simon events. We're back for more. So for those of you who aren't familiar, don't worry. This is something that's still fairly new, especially in pharma, in the applied space. So behavioral science is an umbrella term. It includes all of the different fields of research that help us to first understand why people do what they do, actually, not what they think are the reasons, but are the actual reasons, and then to influence their behavior really effectively based on that understanding. So that includes social psychology, that includes neuroscience, that includes anthropology, et cetera, et cetera. So this is decades and decades of research in a lot of different fields all coming together to be applied to the real world for challenges like the ones you face with your HCP marketing. And this is really important because traditional marketing is generally trying to deal with people's knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, right? We're trying to raise awareness, we're trying to motivate. And that's important, but it's not sufficient because we all have the experience of really intending to go to the gym 5 days a week at 6 a.m. We really want to. We really mean it. We have the motivation, but we don't actually do it. And so this is the really important behavioral science concept called the intent to action gap. And so marketing is sufficient to get us to intent. You need something else to actually close that gap and get the behavior follow through that you really want, and that leads to the business impact that you need. So how do we close the gap? One of the things that's important is to create that intention. And so that's why we have all these great marketing experts in the room. You've heard a lot about that today already. That's what you do every day, right? We create awareness, we create motivation, we create that intention. But then to go that step further and actually help our target audience cross the finish line of the desired behavior, whether that's prescribing, referring, diagnosing, et cetera, you need something more. And so that's where the behavioral science toolkit becomes very useful, because that helps you make it really easy for them to do the thing that you want them to do. Even if they really want to, if it's hard, if they don't have time, if they don't have the tools to do it, you haven't done those tactical things to enable it, you're probably not going to see the success that you would expect and hope for. So I've said there's decades and decades of research across a lot of different fields. That sounds very overwhelming and kind of too nerdy for day-to-day use, and we're aware of that. So what we've done at BVA is we've boiled down into 21 of the most important biases and behavioral science techniques for you to apply to both understand and influence your target audience. So these are things like habits, which we'll talk about a little bit, things that are unconscious, that drive our behavior much more than we realize, that we can then identify in our research techniques and then create solutions, whether it's your marketing campaigns, whether it's interesting contextual tactics, whether that's your communications being done slightly differently. All of those things can use these techniques to close that intent to action gap. So we're not going to go through 21 today, because that's obviously far too many and not very helpful. We're going to go through 4 of those drivers. We're going to talk about how they can apply to your HCP marketing. But first we're going to learn them, and there will be a quiz, so keep that in mind. So we're going to talk about habits. We're going to talk about social norms. We're going to talk about making things easier and how to do that. And then we're going to talk about framing, or the way that we present information. So habits. Everybody talks about habits all the time. This is something that is familiar to the layperson, right? This is not high-tech behavioral science necessarily. But what most people are not aware of is that there is actually a way to break down habits into the component parts of the mechanism. We call it a habit loop. It's very simple. It's got 3 parts in most ways of thinking about this. First is the cue, which is the thing that triggers the habit. So that could be a person, that could be a time of day, that could be a physical place, that could be an emotion that you feel, and that's the thing that starts this loop running. Then you have the behavior, which is actually performing the habit, whatever it happens to be. And then you have the reward, which is the outcome of doing that behavior. And for this to turn into a repetitive loop, obviously that reward needs to be something positive and reinforcing. When we think about it in this way, we are suddenly enabled to fiddle with this in a really fun way and kind of tinker and reprogram what a habit might be. It's really important to remember that when it comes to habits, you can't just start a habit out of nowhere, and you can't just cut a habit off cold turkey and leave a vacuum. So you need to look at what are the existing habit loops in place, and then how can I play with either the cues, create new cues, slightly send the cue in a different way, give them something else to do when they feel that cue, or play with the rewards. Make your thing even more rewarding than the existing habit. Or something about the reward of the existing habit, maybe reduce it or eliminate it, make it less pleasant to do. So when you start to think about the mechanics of it, this gets kind of fun to tinker with. The second of the 4 drivers of influence we're learning today is called norms. So this is about social norms, about us being very social creatures. So there was a really interesting study done on primary care physicians and the issue of antibiotics overprescribing, which we all know is a big public health problem because we don't want antibiotic resistance. So there's lots of interesting campaigns and PSAs and all kinds of big effortful things out there to educate and change this behavior, but it's still happening and it's still a problem. So they tried this nudge instead in this study. And essentially what it was a very simple form letter that they sent to a bunch of primary care practices in a few towns. And it just said, the great majority of practices in your local area prescribe fewer antibiotics per head than yours. So they called them out in comparison to their peers. is a very simple, very cheap intervention, and it led to more than 3% reduction in antibiotic prescribing, and just with this one-off letter, saved over $120,000 in unnecessary medical costs. So yes, those numbers aren't huge, but if you think about the ROI, simple standard letter, you save this much compared to what most people would have done, which is an education campaign, lots of materials, lots of ongoing effort and development. It's very, very efficient, and that's one of the big benefits of behavioral science is because you're cutting right to how people actually think, you're just gonna get to the most effective solution faster without as much effort. The third of the four that we're gonna learn about is easiness. And this is one that's easy to write off, because everyone says, yeah, I know. Obviously, I should make it easier. It should be a nice experience. I know. But people don't take it to the nth degree, and that is where things get kind of interesting, right? Every single click, just one click that you can eliminate, that's friction. We don't want any friction if we can help it. So every single click you can eliminate, every time someone has to scroll, that's friction. If you can reduce any of those, that's where you're gonna start seeing those incremental differences that cost you almost nothing, right? It's just about being cleverer. So in this case, there was a study being done on opioid prescriptions. Obviously, opioid overprescribing can also be a problem because it can lead to substance use issues. And so one thing that they did, again, instead of doing a big educational campaign, et cetera, they just changed the default setting in the EHR. So when they went to prescribe opioids after surgery for their patients in this health system, they would change the default setting from 30 pills to 12 pills. And this is an important point to point out that behavioral science is not about forcing people to do something they don't want to do. It's not about taking away choice. It's about making the best choice the easiest choice. So if they really wanted to prescribe 30 pills, they can just change it. But they have to do a little bit of extra clicking to do that, right? The easiest thing is to stick with 12. And this reduced the amount of opioids prescribed by 15% across this health system. So again, if you imagine that compared to traditional approaches to behavior change that we tend to do is education and trainings and keep reminding people, you don't even have to talk to people. You don't even have to tell them you did this, and yet you get these huge outcomes. Fourth and final one we're going to learn about is framing. So framing is how we present information and what we're drawing attention to about the information that we're presenting. So whether that's the positive or the negative, whether we're linking it to some greater meaning that's beyond perhaps what they might have thought of themselves, framing is really, really powerful. So in this study, it was a randomized controlled trial with doctors. Half of them were given an imaginary patient with lung cancer and told, you can either do radiotherapy or surgery. The survival rate for surgery after 1 month is 90%. The other group was told the same things, except that the survival rate for surgery was 10%. So we know that 90 plus 10 is 100. These are two sides of the exact same coin, and yet had a huge impact on doctors' treatment decision-making. 34% more chose surgery when we present the survival rate. That's insane for a group that we say is so data-driven and so scientific. This very simple flip of percentages had a huge impact on treatment decision-making. So we can't discount this for this group. So I promised you a quiz. We are here now. I'm going to play a game called What's That Nudge? Remember, we've got norms, habits, framing, and easiness, all right? So I'm going to show you an example. You're scrolling on Amazon. You see something you're like kind of interested in. It's fine. But then there's that one click button. You're like, okay, fine, one click. What is this? Very good. We've got 9 out of 10 dentists recommend. Norms, very good. We get back to our office on Friday, back to our normal routine. We go into our desk, we open our laptop, we open Outlook like we always do without even thinking about it, and we start clicking away in our little routine. Very good. This one's a little harder to see, but this is a hypothetical soft drink. I'll draw your attention to the bottom, where instead of just posting calories as information, they post that it'll take 15 minutes of running, 23 minutes of biking, 13 minutes of swimming, presenting that information in a different way. Framing, very good. We're linking it to something a little bit more meaningful. One more bonus one. We get home from our travels Tomorrow night, after a long 2 days of conferencing, we're a little bit worn out. We want to decompress with some Netflix, but even deciding what to watch on Netflix is a little bit overwhelming. And Netflix very helpfully says, if you're not sure, I'll just pick something for you based on what I know about you. And there's one click. Easiness, very good. Congratulations, you're a behavioral scientist. So, now that we've got it, right, we're getting some of these techniques, we're seeing they're simple but effective, and they don't necessarily cost us more, we just need to be a little bit smarter at the right time to apply them. Let's bring this back to your day-to-day. So, if you're thinking about the drugs that you work on or the drugs that you help your clients with, where they're at in their life cycle. Are we launching a drug into a crowded space? Are we launching a drug that's first and only, and they don't even have a treatment prescribing habit, we need to build it? Or are we further down the line, where it's a mature drug in a mature market, and we've got more competitors coming in, and we're trying to stay competitive? Thinking about that, I invite you to ask yourself some of these questions to start applying these 4 techniques when you go back to work. So when we're thinking about habits, how can we change the cues that exist? Are there cues for your drug? Do we need to create some based on what is already in that habitual environment? How can we play with the rewards? Dialing the rewards of our desired behavior up, fiddling with the rewards of things we don't want them to do to make it less reinforcing. Thinking about norms. So what are their peers doing? How do they know what their peers are doing? How do their peers see what they are doing? And who is delivering a message? The transmitter is also really, really important in this social context. When we think about easiness, we all know, yes, of course, we don't want more forms, we don't want more prior auths, et cetera, but even things that are easier to control, like how many clicks, how many times do I make them scroll on the website to find the thing I want them to click on? All of these little things add up to making the desired behavior the easiest behavior, which is a really key takeaway. And then finally, thinking about framing. So when you are presenting this decision or any kind of information related to the decision, they're going to be thinking about, what do I have to gain from doing this? What do I have to gain from sticking with the status quo? What do I have to lose by not doing this? What might I lose? What am I afraid of losing if I make the leap to doing something new? And how can we reduce that risk perception? And even on a bigger picture, how do we link all of that to what it means for their identity? Just like we linked the soda from calories to number of minutes you have to run, right? We've brought it to the next level, to something that means something more personally. In this case, does it mean you're a smart doctor, you're an empathetic doctor, you're a safe doctor? These are things that we can start to play with in the way that we present the things we're going to present to them anyway. So we can just do it in a little bit of a cleverer, more human-centric way. So when we think about those 1,000+ decisions per week that doctors have to make, and we think about all the different ways we can make their life easier, the way that we can present our work or our product or our decision as the easiest and the most attractive in these simple ways without adding a whole bunch of tech, without having to do a big overhaul of the campaign you were going to do anyway, just adding in some of these clever things can make a really big difference with a really great ROI. So we'd love to talk to you more about it. Myself, my colleagues, Mike and David, are here for the rest of the conference. But with that, I will hand it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much, Suzanne. Let's give her a round of applause. Very nice perspective shared there. Obviously, the behavioral analytics side of things is becoming more and more important for omnichannel marketers today. Any real quick questions, comments, or points they'd like to bring up before we move on? For Suzanne? I know, Suzanne, you've got some colleagues here with you this week as well, haven't you?
Mike and David.
Yes, Mike and Dave here. So if anyone has follow-up questions, definitely stop by and connect with Mike, Dave, and Suzanne. Okay. Well, thanks again, Suzanne. Appreciate your time.